It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP and former Business Secretary Andrea Leadsom, Labour MP Chris Bryant, Sonia Soda of The Observer and Olivia Utley of The Telegraph. So, what's going on today?
People in Scotland must have the ability to express their views on independence. Otherwise, Scottish democracy becomes a prisoner of a UK Prime Minister.
The SNP promised a once-in-a-generational vote. Well, that hasn't lasted very long.
19th of October 2023, that's the date Nicola Sturgeon has set for a second independence referendum. But will it happen? The census reveals that there are fewer under 15s than over 65s in England and Wales for the first time ever. So are we having enough babies? And it is a big increase in holiday homes squeezing local people out of the market.
You can't plan anything. Everything comes back to, well, we don't know where we're going to be living.
So it's Prime Minister's questions today, but without Boris Johnson. And that's because he's been busy, as you can see here, striding the world stage. First of all, at the G7 in southern Germany, today in Madrid at the NATO summit. By the end of last week, you might have been forgiven for thinking his time as Prime Minister was coming close to being over and he couldn't risk being abroad for so long. But, as you can see, he's still very much Prime Minister, even though both of you two wanted him gone. So, Andrea, what's happened?
Well, I think that's a bit stretching it a bit. I said to my constituents in a reply to them that I agreed with Sue Gray's analysis and that the Prime Minister needs to take responsibility, which is my absolutely clear view. However, the party has had a confidence vote and it was clearly won by the Prime Minister, and therefore, as with every democratic vote, we then get up the next day and we move on, and what the Prime Minister is doing is seeking to lead the country as he should and make a good fist of it both at NATO and in supporting Ukraine against Russia's aggression.
Right, unacceptable failings of leadership. How can you have changed your mind on that big fundamental?
I haven't changed my mind. What I'm saying is that the Prime Minister needs to take responsibility for it. He has profusely apologised. He said that lessons have been learned, and he's determined to improve things and to make government better, to learn those lessons and to move on.
Are you comfortable, though, Andrea Leadsom, continuing to serve a Prime Minister you clearly have no faith in?
I am very happy with the Conservatives' agenda, with our government's agenda. I think it is absolutely vital that we focus on the things that really matter to people, like the cost of living, like the economy, like getting ourselves back into a good place after the COVID lockdowns and so on. And that is absolutely vital. So yes, I'm backing the government, I'm backing the Prime Minister.
So you're tolerating Boris Johnson, even though you said those unacceptable failures of leadership couldn't be tolerated?
No, I didn't say that. I said there were unacceptable failings of leadership, and I agree with the Sue Gray report. And please don't put words in my mouth. I have been completely clear all the way through. There have been unacceptable failings of leadership. They are the responsibility of the Prime Minister. There was a confidence vote. He won it, and therefore, in line with every democratic vote in this country, whether the media like it or not, we then move on the next day. The next day is a different day, and what the Prime Minister is focusing on is learning those lessons and actually seeking to lead the country in very important issues.
Yes, OK,
like
but it is quite
Russia's
hard to keep up.
It is
quite hard to keep up with the views and opinions of Conservative MPs.
Not the case at all.
And now with Boris Johnson.
I am entirely consistent on this point.
OK.
I've now said twice exactly my opinion and my view. I could not be clearer. I mean, I can say it a third time if that would help, but I do think
you've just given up, basically.
No, I haven't given up at all. That's to put words in my mouth. I think
not putting words in your mouth. It's asking the questions because Because the last
leadership.
time people heard you speak, Andrea Leadsom, those were the words you uttered.
That's not the case
You
at all.
uttered the unacceptable failures of leadership as underlined by the Sue Gray report.
No, that is not true. I wrote to my constituents saying there have been unacceptable failings of leadership and those are the responsibility of the Prime Minister. One of my constituents put that to the press. I made no comment to the press. The day after the vote, I had cameras waiting outside my flat and I was very clear. The only thing I've said on the record at any point is that a vote was held. The vote was won by the Prime Minister. Now we need to move on and focus on the priorities of the people of this country.
Which you said.
Which are
all right, you've made it absolutely clear. We need to move on to what's happened in terms of your strategy for seeing the Prime Minister gone.
Me? Well, I'm completely consistent. I think he should be gone because he is not psychologically
Yes, but what's happened?
competent.
He's still there. He's very much there.
Well, he's not here, and I think that they're using some of this foreign travel as a means of a kind of shield to protect him from what's going on in the tea room and in the House of Commons, which is a lot of Conservative MPs, I'm not saying this about you, Andrea, but a lot of Conservative MPs are saying one thing in private and a completely different thing in public, and they're all plotting. And whereas last time, I think, for the vote of confidence, the first vote of confidence, it was all rather organic, and I suspect, indeed, that Downing Street put some of the names in to have the vote a little bit before the by-elections. Now they are organised, and I think there will be another vote of no confidence. But the only thing I'd say to Andrea is the idea that Boris Johnson, is learning a lesson, I think is mistaken. He's categorically himself said, if you think that there's going to be some big psychological change in me, you've got another thing coming. He will not change. There will be more scandals every single week. We've now got the £150,000 tree house, which is more than the cost of a house in my constituency in the Rhondda, nearly double the cost of some houses.
All right, I'm going to come back to Andrea in just a moment, but let's just get the opening thoughts in terms of what has happened. Boris Johnson is still very much there striding the world stage, despite all the things that have happened. The Sue Gray report, the vote of no confidence, the loss of the by-elections, a fixed penalty notice.
Well, I think what Andrea just said actually illustrates the dilemma that many Conservative MPs are in, which is that the vote of confidence, the timing of that, it was not a sort of coordinated effort by backbench MPs. It just happened to be when a certain number of letters went in. And I think, quite frankly, if the confidence vote had happened after these by-election results that we've seen, that Boris Johnson might not still be Prime Minister. I think it is now going to take some time for him to go as a result. I think there's no question that Boris Johnson is the kind of man who would resign honourably because he's been found to have broken, it's just not going to happen. So he will need to be forced out. And I think the fact that the confidence vote happened a little bit too early for that means it is now going to take some months. We've got another big moment coming up in the autumn when the Privileges Committee produces its report on whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament. And I think that will be another moment of danger, actually, for Johnson.
Olivia?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it is going to take a little while now. That no confidence vote did happen too early, really, and I think it is quite possible that there were some people in Downing Street who were putting names in so that it could happen before the by-elections. I think there are plenty of Conservative MPs who are completely fed up with him, and it is true that it doesn't look like he's going to really change. So I think the most likely thing that happens is there is some way of rejigging the policy so that there will be another vote of no confidence within the next 6 months or so, and or else the Privileges Committee brings him down. That said, I mean, I do feel a little bit sorry for the Prime Minister because, we say that he's strutting along on the world stage to distract from what's going on at home. It was quite important that he was at the G7 and quite important that he's at the NATO summit as well. And actually, I'm not usually a huge fan of G7 summits. Sometimes it feels a bit like they're just kind of jamborees. But this one, there did seem to be some agreement. So, it is important that he is there and he is doing his job.
Well, as Sonia said, the Privileges Committee, I will come to you in just a second, the Privileges Committee is choosing a chairman. That's the committee that's being tasked with an inquiry into whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament and MPs over Partygate. Andrea, do you think if he has and is found to have misled Parliament, he will resign then?
I mean, actually, the process of the Privileges Committee, and by the way, I'm delighted that it is being established, and the government very clearly allowed, if you like, didn't whip MPs on our side to vote against that, allowed that to go through, which was really important. So it is a good opportunity to clarify what's gone on. It's cross-party.
Yep.
Those select committees tend to work very collegiately together. We very rarely have a split
Absolutely.
report.
So if he's found to have misled Parliament, will he resign?
Well, you know, that is got to wait until its findings come out. What's important right now is that every MP has confidence in the establishment of that Privileges Committee and in the process that's about to take place.
Right.
But as to what happens at the end of it, you've got to wait until the outcome.
Well, what I'm
of
sort of
that.
asking is, do you think he will go then? I mean, it's a pretty egregious breach to have misled Parliament. It doesn't mean that he'll resign.
It depends what the Privileges Committee says. I mean, if it's a completely... he's deliberately misled Parliament, there would be consequences of that, because, no, exactly.
Well, I know, or but if he deliberately misled Parliament...
If he's deliberately misled Parliament and the Privileges Committee were to say, therefore, there will be consequences, and it were to go, for example, back to the Standards Committee, then it could... You know,
Chris, what would the sanction... Could the sanction be other than him having to resign?
So the House can't make the Prime Minister resign unless there's a vote of confidence of the whole House. The committee could recommend that he just apologise to the House. The committee might say, oh, well, hang on, you've sort of apologised already, and this is so egregious and so many instances when you have misled Parliament. And the issue isn't deliberately misled, by the way, it's knowingly misled. It's a subtle difference, but I think it's an important one which the committee will have to consider. So, for instance, Admiral Lord Nelson, was he lying when he put his spyglass to his blind eye and said, what ships? I see no ships? Did the Prime Minister get real assurances or didn't he? He said that he did. Anyway, you asked me the specific question, and I know you're looking grumpy with me.
No.
What the sanction might be, that the House could decide, either because of the committee recommends it or because the House decides, to suspend him from the House. I think... if any Prime Minister was suspended even for a single day from the House of Commons, he would have to go.
Right, OK, well, that's what I'm getting to. And I tell you the reason why, because your colleague, Steve Baker, Conservative MP, who is fed up with the Prime Minister, is worried that he might not resign, even if he is found to have knowingly misled Parliament. You see, hang on, my question then only to you is... would you support the rules being changed, the rules in the Conservative Party that would allow you to have another confidence vote in the Prime Minister in 6 months?
I wouldn't, and the reason for that is because I don't believe in, if you don't like the answer, asking the same question again and changing the rules to enable yourself to. However, in answer to your question of what happens then, if, as Chris says, if there were a suspension and if the individual suspended would not resign, that could then go to a matter of bringing the House into disrepute, and then that has a whole new avenue which goes to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, which could come back to the Standards Committee through the Independent Expert Panel. I mean, Chris and I have lived through this for many years. There are routes.
You can tell.
It's not the end of the story, but I won't bore you with
the point is he's never going to change. This is him. This is how he behaves. And the very fact that we're thinking that the House could suspend him and he wouldn't then, in honour, resign is the problem that we've got.
All right, I'm going to... that. Jo is postulating.
No, that's all I'm asking the question. Thank you for that, Andrea.
I actually agree with Steve Baker, to be honest. I think there is a chance with this Prime Minister that he gets suspended from the House for a day or two and thinks, well, I'm just going to try and brazen it through.
What do you think, Olivia?
I think that's quite likely. He's brazened everything else out.
Well, on that note of... agreement...
the House could decide to go for 10 days, suspended for 10 days, and then it's up to the voters in his constituency that would decide whether he remains. I think they'd turf him out.
Let's talk about something completely different. You heard in the headlines about Nicola Sturgeon naming a date, as it says here on the front page of The Scotsman, ahead of a long battle for referendum. This was the announcement the First Minister told Holyrood yesterday. She intends to hold it on the 19th of October 2023 if it is considered legal by judges in the UK Supreme Court. We're joined by the SNP's Cabinet Office spokesman, Stuart Hosey. Stuart, welcome to you. What makes you confident that the Supreme Court will rule in your favour? I mean, they have ruled quite recently last year against you.
The Supreme Court will come to its own decisions. And this isn't a matter of whether or not I or the Scottish Government are confident. But we made a case in 2014 that we didn't believe we needed the Section 30 transfer to have a referendum. What the First Minister said yesterday is that she's spoken with the Lord Advocate and she is now going to put that to the Supreme Court. The papers are lodged so that we no longer have a debate based on political opinion or legal opinion. We actually determine the legal fact, and that puts it beyond doubt. I think that's the right approach to take.
Right. People might question, though, your decision to do that, or Nicola Sturgeon's decision to do that. When you look last year, the Supreme Court ruled that 2 bills that were passed unanimously by members of the Scottish Parliament were beyond the powers of Holyrood. And they said it was because the legislation in both cases could affect Westminster's ability to make laws in Scotland. And another referendum would surely be seen in precisely the same light.
Not necessarily, because the referendum itself, like every other referendum in the UK, is consultative. What it would then lead to would be negotiations on independence. It would not automatically lead to a change to the UK circumstance. So this is the correct approach. Publish the legislation, set the date, have it tested in the Supreme Court, and if it is absolutely legal and within the competence of the Scottish Parliament, proceed with that referendum next October.
Andrea, there is a clear majority of MSPs in Holyrood in favour of another referendum, and therefore a clear mandate, as there has been on numerous occasions, for that referendum, and the Conservative government is continuing to deny democracy.
Well, I'm absolutely astonished that Nicola Sturgeon would yet again be allocating 20 million quid of Scottish taxpayers' money towards a referendum instead of focusing on the fact that maths and science league tables, Scotland has fallen far behind, the lowest since the early 2020s, as I understand it. And for Stuart, again, to be talking about another referendum, I've always nailed my colours to the mast. You have your referendum, you listen to the people speak, and then you do what they say. It was billed as the once in a generation. It was 9 years ago. That is not a generation. This is a huge distraction for people in Scotland and for people of the United Kingdom. And I think Stuart actually is really pushing it to say that they just want to test this in the courts. That is just a nonsense. This is just about the Scotnats wanting to campaign for one single issue rather than on focusing on really important issues for Scottish people.
Stuart?
Well, of course, the Scottish Government concentrate on important issues every day, but this idea that democracy stands still because there was once a referendum is just facile nonsense. There have been 3 UK general elections in the past 7 years. Elections and democracy doesn't stand still. People are allowed to change their mind, and indeed, when the circumstances change, like the hard Tory Brexit we have, people should change their mind, and because we have a mandate, the Scottish people should have another opportunity to choose a different future.
Andrea?
So, Stuart, what currency would the Scots use should they choose to go for their unilateral declaration of independence? Would they join the European Union? How long would that take? Who would be the lender of last resort? What would happen to the incredibly successful financial services sector in Edinburgh, to the incredibly successful shipyards that provide ships and warships for the UK fleets, for the UK military? What would happen to the military? What would Scotland actually do to become independent? All of these questions go unanswered whilst you spend £20 million of Scottish taxpayers' money on yet another campaign for a referendum.
Stuart?
Well, let's be really clear. All of these questions were fully answered in 2014.
No, they weren't.
They will be, yes, they were. They will be fully answered in the run-up to the referendum in 2023. But can I just correct one thing? Andrea, you said a unilateral declaration of independence. No one is declaring UDI. The whole point about the First Minister's statement yesterday is whatever we do, whatever route we take to achieve Scottish independence will be absolutely legal. You must stop saying things to the public which aren't true, Andrea. I know it's difficult for a Tory, but there will not be a declaration of UDI.
Stuart, you're calling for a independence referendum, and the First Minister has clearly said that if the UK government doesn't give it to you, you will do it anyway. If that isn't a unilateral declaration, then what is? So yes, now you're sort of insisting that you're simply going to test it in the courts. But you are spending £20 million of taxpayers' money that should be going on improving health services and education and the number of police on the streets, and not wasted on another project, which is just an obsession for the Scot Nats.
Stuart, can I just put to you the other part of Nicola Sturgeon's announcement? Because she also said that if the referendum doesn't happen, she'll fight the next election, the next UK general election, on the single issue of independence. Are you really saying to voters that you'll completely ignore the number one priority and all the other priorities of people, but the cost of living, the rising cost of living, won't even come up? The state of public services in Scotland and a myriad other problems to pursue this single constitutional issue?
No, it's not pursuing a single constitutional issue. It's about delivering Scottish independence to properly tackle all of these issues.
Although, as you know, many people know you already have the levers, particularly when it comes to issues of health and education and even some tax-raising powers. You have said that you will fight the campaign on the issue of independence. I take your point that then you may be able to do other things in terms of those issues, but the election campaign would only be about the Constitution.
Let's be very clear. Independence isn't a constitutional issue in its own right. It's to give the Scottish people, its Parliament, all of the powers necessary to tackle all of the issues. But as for running the general election on the independence question, if that is the only legal route to allowing the Scottish people to change the constitutional settlement, if this undemocratic Tory government continue to say no to a Section 30 transfer, then it strikes me that there's no choice but to do that. And on that basis, the First Minister was absolutely right.
Well, on that issue, Andrea, on that, I mean, as a leading Brexiteer during the campaign to leave the EU, do you not recognise the deep desire for sovereignty?
Of course I do, absolutely. But the United Kingdom is a sovereign nation with four devolved parts to it. It is a wholly stronger together United Kingdom. It's entirely different matter from the leaving the European Union, which we'd been in for, in the end, I think 44 years, and with its failure to create a single currency, a single tax regime, single pensions, even a single language. But for the United Kingdom, it's a vastly different situation. But I just put to you again, Stuart, you simply can't ignore the very real and pressing problems of the people of Scotland just to pursue what is an obsession for the Scottish nationalists.
Stuart?
Well, it isn't. We don't ignore any of these problems. You mentioned them a few moments ago. Police. We increased the number of police over a decade ago. We've kept them high. I think people in England will look askance at how well we're doing in terms of the lowest crime rate for 40 years. Compared to what happens in England.
All right, well, hang on. Andrea and Chris have mentioned their drug deaths. And actually, there is a very pertinent example of that, Stuart, because how do you explain to voters that there was a debate on the number of drug deaths in Scotland due to take place in Holyrood yesterday? It didn't happen because it was bumped off by your announcement on another independence referendum. And that underlines precisely that you are putting aside very important issues, which you would agree, for this issue.
I have to say, this story is preposterous.
Why?
The debate...
Was it put off?
The debate was put back until Thursday with the agreement of all parties, including the Labour Party. It was agreed in the Business Bureau this debate would be moved to give it the time it needed to have. It's an incredibly important issue, but instead of having a debate on the television now about a debate being moved by 48 hours...
It's not that, it's about priorities. It's about what voters might think of it.
It is about priorities, and wouldn't it be better if the UK government prioritised the power to allow the Scottish government to have safe drug consumption rooms rather than holding their faces against that measure, which would undoubtedly save lives, because it's the Tories in London who are playing politics with drug deaths, nobody else.
All right. Let me just ask you about something else, which is Patrick Grady, the former SNP MP who's decided to sit as an independent. He was accused of sexual assault. There was an investigation and complaint upheld by an independent panel. He was suspended for a number of days. The SNP also suspended him from the party for a week. But now it looks as if the Metropolitan Police is going to take up the investigation following a complaint. Your colleague Joanna Cherry said the party needs to reflect on its handling of this whole incident. She refers to an SNP meeting where Ian Blackford, the party's leader at Westminster, urged all members to support Patrick Grady. Stuart Hosey, were you at that Westminster group meeting?
No, I was. I think it was actually in this building doing Sky Television at the time. But what I would say is, you're right, the complaint against Patrick Grady was investigated. He accepted the outcome of that, and the punishment offered an unreserved apology. But as for the comments that followed, I think it's right that the SNP, indeed all parties, because all parties face these matters from time to time.
Sure they do, but on this, Joanna Cherry has said you do need to review your practices. You haven't handled it well. Would you agree with her?
I'm not sure I would be in a position to say it was handled well or otherwise. What I would say is that when you're talking about pastoral care to members and staff, to victims or complainants, to those who are the subject of complaints, I think it's important that all parties get this right. On that, I wouldn't disagree at all.
All right, thank you very much. Stuart Hosey there, joining us here on the programme. Now, results of last year's once-in-a-decade census have been released. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian. England and Wales population hits record as over 65s overtake under 15s. 1 in 5 people in England and Wales are now over 65. It's the highest proportion ever recorded. Let me bring in my other guests who haven't had a shout for a while. Sonia, what's your view?
So I think this is a really important public policy issue, and it's a bit of a weird one because obviously the decision about when and whether to have children is intensely personal, but when you add up all those decisions, it has a big, big public policy impact on the costs of an ageing society and being able to support, you know, a really good older age where you've got proper pension support, etc. Now, I think there's 3 things when it comes to the falling fertility rate. The first is it's crazy to make it more financially difficult for people to have children at a time when the cost of living is going up. We've got very high housing costs in this country. The government that Andrea was part of has slashed away at financial support for low-income parents, tax credits. It's absolutely crazy from a long-term financial perspective as well as a moral perspective. Secondly, I think it's crazy that we restrict fertility treatment. So fertility treatment on the NHS is getting harder and harder to get. And actually, women in same-sex relationships, single women, don't have the same rights of access as couples. And again, why would we do that when our fertility rate is going down and people want to have children? And thirdly, I think we need to look at expectations on mothers in modern society. We know that actually couples decide to have fewer children and have them later as societies get richer. That's because women, they have careers and jobs, and that's a fantastic thing. But at the moment, too much of the caring load falls on mothers, and I think we need to think about how to create a society where it's split more evenly between mums and dads and has similar impacts on their careers.
Olivia?
Well, I agree with a lot of that, but I think the main issue really is how ludicrously expensive childcare is in this country. I think I'm right in saying it's the most expensive in the whole of Europe. I want to have children soon. My husband and I were sort of actually looking into it properly, and suddenly we saw that, in London, you're looking at up to £2,000 for a month for a nursery place for one child. I mean, that's almost the entirety of one of our salaries. So it's just almost completely impossible. And a big part of that is massive over-regulation of the childcare sector. My cousin, for example, is now a childminder, but it took her nearly a year to jump through all the millions of sort of Ofsted hoops. It was like she was becoming a sort of university lecturer. Obviously, there have got to be some sort of checks and balances in place to make sure you've got the right people looking after children. But it does seem to be overdone. I think the other thing is it's not just a policy issue. I think it's wider than that, really. I think that we're living in a country now where children and families are just not put first. I mean, we saw throughout lockdown the way that children's needs were just routinely completely ignored, and we can see the effect that that's having now. You've got children growing up who are far behind their peers from a few years ago because they were locked in their homes for 2 years, unable to go to school, unable to socialise, etc., because their needs just weren't really being considered.
Chris, on that point, that philosophical sort of point about do we need more babies, how do we get them?
Well, I'm not the world's expert
No.
on bringing babies into the world as a gay man, and I feel as if I'm letting the side down a bit. Interestingly, I'm 60 now, and so I'm nearly in this higher category. I think I'm the oldest person on the panel. I'm quite conscious of it, that we are an ageing population. I do a lot of work about acquired brain injury, and we're trying to bring together a national strategy for the UK at the moment. And interestingly, I was in the Children's Hospital in Birmingham last week, and they were telling me that the incidence of children, young children, coming into hospital with brain injuries as a result of domestic violence from their parents, including children being thrown out of a window, had risen 70% during COVID. So I think we're absolutely right. There's a massive problem around how children are growing up during this period. If there's one policy, this is not the formal policy of the Labour Party, this is just my policy. If there's one policy I would love to introduce, it is free universal childcare provided by the state for everybody.
I totally agree on that.
I think it just makes it so much easier. I mean, I'm conscious in Parliament, there's not many mums. You're a glorious exception, Andrea. There are not very many
more
mums,
of them,
but
though.
there are more now, but it's
I mean,
really, really difficult to be a mum in parliamentary life. And just one final thing, which is about the workforce. I'm conscious, you know, if you look in the NHS at the moment, we've not got enough occupational therapists, we've not got enough, I mean, nearly every discipline is short of staff. We haven't got enough bar staff in the country. We've not got enough people to do construction. There's so many different areas where we're going to need more workers in future years.
Well,
and how are we going to address any of that?
I think we should have a word with Keir Starmer and tell him to make it Labour policy.
Well, there you go. Let's see if it becomes Labour policy.
If you're listening, I agree.
You don't have to whisper it, you can say it out loud. Andrea, are we running out of babies and do we need to do something fundamental about it?
We really do. And, you know, I agree with much of what's been said, actually. There's a huge breakout of peace here going on. I mean,
Except for the costs, then, if we pick up on that, first of all, on the government. You listen to both Sonia and Olivia.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I'll come on to childcare, but just a bit of a pitch for the Best Start for Life project that I'm chairing on behalf of the government, because actually, the one thing that's not been raised is how hard it is to have a baby, to be a new parent. You know, if you're a single parent, it's mind-blowingly difficult. And if you're in a loving relationship with a same-sex couple or an opposite-sex couple, it's still incredibly challenging to be a new parent. So what the Start for Life vision, that this project I'm chairing, which has got 300 million quid from the government, is setting out to do is to provide much, much more support for families, right through from conception to the age of 2, to help people to have the confidence, the understanding, the self-knowledge, the protections from their own feelings. And Chris is right. You know, there have been massive problems in lockdown. It was such a mistake to have health visitors move to online. And there's been such a backlog now of babies who've not really socialised. But for most parents, the one thing you long for when you've got a new baby is company, and it's the one thing you were denied in COVID. And the greatest risk of dying a violent death is when you are less than a year old. So to Chris's point about shaken babies, it's absolutely right. And that's at the very stark end of safeguarding. Of course. But for every family, it's so difficult.
Just pitch one bit into your... Because, Andrew, you've done great work on this, and for a very long time. I'm full of admiration for it. Just about the brain injury thing.
Yeah.
Kids from poorer backgrounds are 4 times more likely to have a serious brain injury before their 5th birthday. Yeah. Quite often undiagnosed, but lots of them diagnosed. We've got, than kids from a wealthy background. We've got to get to the bottom of that, because that leads to so many other later problems in life for that child. May end up in the criminal justice system because of never having had the rehabilitation that they needed earlier on.
All right, let me go back to the childcare costs. Because we can talk about incentives. Do you agree with the rest of the panel that doing something, providing something like universal childcare would tip the balance towards people having many more children?
Up to a point. What I think is, what I would see as a centre-right version of that, which we don't have at the moment, is to give every new parent a budget for free childcare hours before your child goes to school. Because at the moment, you've got this if your child is 3, and if you're on low income, you get a certain number of hours when the child is 2. But of course, for most people, particularly as Sonia said, you know, mums have careers. They want to go back to work. They're not going to wait until the child is 3 before they can take up their career again. They need the income. So actually, if you said to parents, here's your digital budget for, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 hours of free childcare, use them when you want, and it ticks down, and once you run out, then you're on your own. That actually also goes with the grain of people's careers, because when you're a new parent, you're earning less, you're very concerned concerned about the safety of your baby. You want them in a good place. Later on, you might be happier with a cheaper cost of a childminder. I also completely agree with Olivia about the hoops people have to go through to become childminders. And I'm afraid that was, not to be party political, but it was introduced under Labour, was all of these things. The one thing that sticks in my mind...
If we're going to do party, the provision of childcare in Wales is better than in England, thanks to a Labour
under a Labour government. Can I just get Sonia's response? Can I just get Sonia's response, though?
I just did want to say, with childminders, fire doors, having to have every door in your house with fire doors is so expensive if you want to
But taking a step back, because if we look at some other examples, Italy started giving people €800 per baby, and there's still a falling birth rate. Japan gives people a one-off payment on birth of 420,000 yen, equivalent to £2,500. Birth rate still falling.
Yeah. Well, I think there's two things to say about that. First of all, we've got to look at the costs of having a child over the child's life rather than a one-off bonus. I'm afraid those policies are quite gimmicky and I don't think they work. But I think the finances are critical and really important, but they only take you so far because some people are choosing not to have children because of career, etc. So I think we need... I think that point about use it or lose it, parental leave for the second parent, the father, in the first year of a child's life, to try and get dads more involved in the care of their children for the rest of their child's life, that is absolutely key, because while it falls disproportionately on women, it is going to be hard to encourage more women to want to have children as well.
You were looking a little bit sceptical about the sort of gimmick, as Sonia called it, in terms of giving a one-off payment.
No, I might just have a sceptical face.
Sceptical face.
I agree with Sonia, actually, that it isn't just about the finances. I think that the birth rate is falling across the whole of Western Europe is a sign that it's very cultural. And I think it is that we just don't live in this kind of pro-natal society anymore. And I think, lockdown is a very good example of that. But I think it's very... you have people like Meghan and Harry getting an award for saying that they only want 2 children because it's more friendly to the environment. I think that sort of thing is quite toxic, and I think it puts would-be mothers off. So I do think it is about more than the finances.
And I think briefly, it's not just about women as well. I mean, I've got so many friends in our late 30s, early 40s. It's men's decisions too, and sometimes men in relationships really drag their feet when it comes to having children. So it can't just be about women.
All right, well, on that note, I'm sorry, Andrew, we'll have to move on, because analysis by the BBC has found that the number of holiday lets in England, we've changed subjects, if I haven't warned you, has risen significantly over the last 3 years. We're parking the babies issue. Let's find out more from our political correspondent, Helen Catt, who is at Croyd Bay in North Devon. Hello to you, Helen. What did you discover?
So we got figures from 152 councils across England, and we asked them how many holiday lets they knew they had in their areas. And so in most cases, that's going to be holiday lets that are available for more than 140 days of the year, and they are registered for business rates. In those figures, we found there was a 40% increase across England in that 3-year period. But more than that, in some of the areas that were already pretty highly saturated, they also saw significant increases. So, for example, here in North Devon, the number rose by 1/3 in 3 years. In Great Yarmouth, it went up by 44%. In Scarborough, 43%. The Isle of Wight, 39%. Now, some holiday let owners have said that they switched to business rates during the pandemic to be able to access COVID grants, so that may explain a little bit of the scale of that rise. But what we do know is that on the ground, there are examples of long-term rentals being turned over into holiday lets, creating scarcity for locals. It's an issue that MPs have been raising in Westminster for some time. Certainly, I've been speaking to some backbenchers of all parties for more than a year on this issue. And here on the ground, they are really feeling the impact. So I've been speaking to some people here in North Devon about what's happening.
I just think it's really unfair that in an area where you've grown up and you've lived, you've been part of the community, you've been to school, all your friends and family are here, to feel that you're being pushed out just so that somebody could have a holiday or that somebody can have a second home just doesn't really resonate as fair.
Helen, is everyone you've spoken to opposed to these holiday lets?
Well, do you know what? Actually, what's really struck me, Jo, is that speaking to people here, actually nobody I've spoken to has been in that sort of combative, look, let's get the grockles out, we don't want holiday makers, we don't want any second homes, we don't want any holiday lets. That's really not the attitude here. There's just this sense that things have got a bit out of balance, particularly over the last few years, and that something needs to be done to be able to enable local communities to continue when the holiday makers aren't here. And I think the reason behind that recognition is that tourism is the major employer here. It's a fairly low-wage area of the country. Tourism is the major employer. It creates jobs through holiday lets, and for some businesses, the summer season, that is their entire business.
It's everything. It's literally how we operate as a business. We pretty much only open through March till end of October, and that is the tourist season. There is nothing here in winter, really, so it is the main time of the year where everyone comes down. We welcome everyone down.
Helen, Kat there in Devon, thank you very much for telling us about that story and what you found out about the numbers of holiday lets. What do you make of what Helen said? And also, I just wanted to raise this issue that Michael Gove, Levelling Up Communities Secretary, has said that second homeowners face Airbnb ban as he plans crackdown on holiday lettings to protect tenants living in tourist hotspots. It will go to regional mayors, I think, authorities. But do you agree with Michael Gove in a way of tackling this problem?
Well, I think exactly as your presenter there said, it is a question of balance in everything. You know, on the one hand, in lovely places like Devon and Cornwall, there isn't much industry, and so they're very dependent on the tourist sector. So they need flow of people in the summer, but not so much so that it squeezes out local people. So it is balanced in everything. And actually there is...
But how do you achieve that?
Well, there is actually a consultation that was announced today by DCMS into the impact of this sudden spike, which is largely, I think, down to Airbnb and people seeing that opportunity to make some money. And obviously what you can do, some of the things in this consultation are going to be things like a kite mark, so that you kind of have to have this kite mark in order to sell yourself as a holiday let, etc. So there are things that you can do rather than a sort of specific ban, because when you create a ban, you then sort of have ways to get round it, and that has unintended consequences. And certainly you need tourism.
I mean, in Wales, obviously, it's a big issue.
It's very similar in Wales, similar issues. It cuts both ways, of course, because people want to make a living, and one way of making a living, especially because of the COVID period, when people couldn't get abroad to Spain, and this year they might not even have a passport because the passport agency is still a complete nutter mess. And the airlines haven't got enough staff, and the airports haven't got enough staff. So there's an increasing demand in the UK for holidays in the UK. There's one interesting thing, another part of the housing market which I think is really worrying, in particular in London and the South East, is that lots of properties, new build properties, never end up having anybody living in them. Because they're bought by, Russian investors, oligarchs or whatever. And what they've done in Amsterdam recently is they said any new build cannot be let for the first 4 years.
OK, well,
it's got to be lived in.
Are you in favour of those sorts of restrictions coming into place to allow the people we heard there being able to afford homes in the areas that they grew up? I mean, this is the headline that I was talking about in the Daily Mail. Second homeowners face Airbnb ban as Michael Gove plans crackdown on holiday lettings to protect tenants living in tourist hotspots.
I am. I don't think you can blame individuals looking to sort of more lucrative ways of making money through things like short-term lets, but it does have a real social cost on these local communities. British renters pay the highest rents in Europe, based absolutely in terms of share of income, and they get terrible value for money from the rental market. So what I would do is, rather than sort of crude bans, I would probably look at the way I tax, or if I was in government, how you tax people who rent housing at reasonable rates on long-term lets and people who make more money from it. And I think we probably need to adjust the balance through taxation so it isn't quite so profitable to go down the Airbnb route anymore.
Olivia?
Yeah, I mean, I do feel for people who... I mean, it's awful if you're pushed out and not able to rent in the place where you live. On the other hand, I mean, it is completely true that there are plenty of people who need that little bit of extra income that they can get from renting out their own house for a little bit while they go away. So it's tricky, and I don't think a ban is the right idea because, as Andrea said, people do just find ways around the ban. So... perhaps taxing is the answer, though I don't like saying that.
All right, we're on that. We've got
you It's a whole centre-left agenda.
Being government.
Andrea
I'm over here on the right.
No, you're centre-left, really.
Well, I'm in the very centre
you might be
for
one
this
of the
programme.
Tory MPs who's coming to the Labour Party.
Oh, gosh, imagine that.
Oh, yes, have you been grilled about whether you're about to defect?
A very, very good, staunch Conservative friend of mine did get a call from a journalist saying, are you one of those going to the left? And he was like, what? You must be joking. So this does seem to be a little story that's taking on...
I know, but I think it's... I think it's Downing Street that are pushing this story out.
Yeah.
I suspect it's Downing Street. You know it's full of scoundrels.
Right, I'm afraid, much as I'd love to leave you to...
Intelligence than there is.
Well, no, control of the process.
You need to have your own show and conversation. But until then, you've tried.
We have. We have tried. No, we've made a bid.
Don't let it put you off, having been turned down once.
Ooh,
you could also...
Look at you enjoying that. Look at you enjoying that. What was the...
I've forgotten what I'm supposed to be doing now because of these two. It's Prime Minister's questions, but with the deputies. That was Angela Rayner. Is that your response to Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab? Coming up in a few minutes' time. We might be able to show you the chamber briefly. There it is, filling up. Michael Fabricant asking a question or contributing to the debate. Briefly, though, Steve Bray, the Stop Brexit man. You all remember him. Well, his amplifiers have been seized outside Parliament under the new laws brought in recently, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, including restrictions on noisy protests. There he is. Are you pleased or unhappy, Andrea, with that outcome?
Relieved. I'd actually had 6 years of abuse from him. But just to say, not only him on the Brexit side, but also colleagues such as Diane Abbott of Labour, Anna Soubry of the Conservative Party, got masses of abuse from Brexiteers. So whoever is doing this really vile abuse endlessly should stop.
Are you pleased or not about his amplifiers being taken, loudspeakers?
I'm really upset. It's not patriotic or British to close down dissent. And he does it quite charmingly.
6 years, Chris.
He's never...
It's quite loud, isn't it?
Well,
he doesn't.
And who cares? Honestly, this is the kind of thing they do in Russia.
All right, I think we're going into the chamber. I think we're going into the chamber for Prime Minister's questions. It's quite noisy in here.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. He attended the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Rwanda, the G7 Leaders Summit, and today he's at the NATO Summit in Madrid. Mr. Speaker, I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with the family and friends of Dame Deborah James following the news of her death. I lost my father at a young age to cancer. I will know firsthand the pain that her family must be feeling. But we also know that Dame Deborah was a huge inspiration to so many and raised millions to help others affected by cancer.
Andrew Jones. Nationally, 52% of disabled people are in work compared with 81% for non-disabled people. Disability Action Yorkshire, which is a charity based in Harrogate, works to close that gap, and they have highlighted the success of the Access to Work scheme. For example, one young person, having been told he would never work, is now, thanks to the targeted support available, a trainee brewer at Roosters Brewery. So will my right honourable friend consider how we can boost awareness amongst employers of this Access to Work scheme, and also consider how we can simplify the application process so more disabled people don't get deterred and will embrace it? Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend for raising the work of Disability Action Yorkshire? They're doing terrific work in his constituency. I can reassure him that the DWP is committed to improving awareness through campaigns and partnerships with employers, but also disability organisations. They're also working specifically on a digital service which will make it more accessible and more visible.
Deputy Leader Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I also share with the Deputy Prime Minister his deepest condolences and his personal experience as we mourn the loss of Dame Deborah James, who fearlessly campaigned to inspire so many, and I'm absolutely sure there's no doubt that she saved the lives of many more. And to the family of Zara Alina, who was tragically murdered this week on the streets of Ilford. Well, Mr. Speaker, I also want to congratulate the two honourable members, the new members, who won in the by-elections this week, including my honourable friend, the member for Wakefield. Mr Speaker, this week the government lost 2 by-elections in one day, the first in 3 decades. It's no wonder that the Prime Minister has fled the country and left the honourable member to carry the can. The people of Wakefield and Tiverton held their own vote of no confidence. The Prime Minister isn't just losing the room, Mr Speaker, he's losing the country. But instead of showing some humility, he intends to limp on until the 2030s. So does he think the Cabinet will prop him up for this long?
Deputy Prime Minister. I thank the Right Honourable Lady. I gently point out to her that we want this Prime Minister to go on a lot longer than she wants the leader of the Labour Party to go on. Mr Speaker, we've got a working majority of 75. We're focusing on delivering for the British people. Record low unemployment wouldn't have happened if we'd listened to the Labour Party. More policing, tougher sentencing in force this week. Police, Courts, Crime and Sentencing Act. She voted against both, so did the Labour Party. And we'll protect the public from these damaging rail strikes when we've got the scene of Labour front benchers joining the picket lines.
Here we go again, but the truth is, what I want for my honourable friend, the Leader of this opposition, is not to be the Leader of the opposition, but to be the Prime Minister of this country. And to be honest, Mr Speaker, it couldn't come quick enough. Britain can't stomach this Prime Minister for another 8 years. His own backbenchers can't stomach him for another 8 minutes. And if they continue to prop him up, Mr Speaker, I doubt the voters will stomach him for even 8 seconds in the ballot box. Now let's imagine, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is still clinging on into the 2030s. Under this tax-high, low-growth Tory government, at this rate, by 2030, the British public will have endured 55 tax rises. Yep. So how many more tax rises will this government inflict on working families before he says enough is enough?
Deputy Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, I think she was right first time. Mr Speaker, I'll tell you what we're doing. Near record levels of youth unemployment, 3.8% unemployment. We're cutting taxes next month on national insurance, £330 million. We're delivering for families through the difficult times of the cost of living. What about the Labour Party? We heard yesterday what their plan is. Their plan is no plan. The leader of the Labour Party said he's wiping the slate clean. He's starting from scratch. He's only been in the job 2 years. Sir Tony Blair, who's actually got some experience of winning elections, says there's a gaping hole in Labour's policy offer, and all the while there's a smile creeping over her face. All the while she's revelling in it. We're getting on with serving the people of this country. She's just playing political games.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd revel in the opportunity for the people of this country to have more than just by-elections to see what they think of this government opposite. Call a general election and see where the people are, Mr Speaker. And this is a man who once said high levels of government taxation was hurting UK competitiveness. Now he's backing the Prime Minister who wants to put taxes up 15 times. At this rate, Mr Speaker, working people will be paying £500 billion more in tax by 2030. Yeah. How high does he think the burden on working people should get before he says enough is enough?
Deputy Prime Minister. We're the ones helping working people with a tax cut of £330, with the support for those on the lowest incomes, with the £650 support for 8 million on the lowest incomes, and with, frankly, the record level of investment coming into this country, from the £1 billion by Moderna for vaccines to the highest level tech investment in Europe, according to Atomico. We are the ones with a plan for low unemployment, a high wage, a high skill economy. At Labour, it's back to year zero.
Yeah. Angela Rayner.
Mr Speaker, he pretends to empathise with those struggling with the Tory cost of living crisis when it was he himself who once said that food bank users are not in poverty but simply have a cash flow problem. The honourable member doesn't. He spent over £1 million in 9 months on private jets. It shows how out of touch this government is, Mr Speaker. But at this rate, by 2030, 1 million more people will be using food banks. How many more working people will be pushed into poverty by his Prime Minister before he says enough is enough?
I tell you, if the Labour Party, if the Right Honourable Lady wants to help working people, they should be clear in standing up against these militant, reckless strikes by RMT. The Right Honourable Lady has flip-flopped. The Right Honourable Lady has flip-flopped all over the place when it came to these strikes. First she said they were lose-lose. Then she tweeted workers were left with no choice. When she was asked by the BBC, straight question, she's normally a straight-shooting politician, do you like the RMT? She said, I'm going to have to go now. I've got a train to catch. She talks about working people. She talks about working people. She talks about working people. Where was the Right Honourable Lady when the comrades were on the picket line last Thursday? Where was she when the Labour front bench were joining them rather than standing up for the public? She was at the Glyndebourne Music Festival, sipping champagne, listening to opera. Champagne socialism is back in the Labour Party.
Well, Mr Speaker, that says a lot about the party opposite. I'll tell them a few things about militancy. It's this government that are acting in a militant way. And while they should have been at the negotiating table, they were at the banqueting table getting hundreds of thousands squeezed out of their donors instead of dealing with a crisis. And he talks about trains. No one can get trains because of his failed transport minister, Mr Speaker. And I tell you, he has a stronger stomach than his...
I think we'll just have a little quiet. I want to hear the question, and you'll also want to hear the answer. Angela Rayner.
Well, Mr Speaker, I think it's rather ironic that you have to intervene because of the baying mob here when they've got people through their noisy protest laws being stopped after protesting out on the street. The thing is, Mr Speaker, they don't like it when the public say what they think of them. But I tell you, the honourable gentleman opposite has a stronger stomach than his colleagues behind him.
Honestly, I want to hear the question, I want to hear the answer. And I hate to say it, so do your constituents. Think about them for once instead of yourselves. Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And when they were asked about the absent Prime Minister's plans to stick around until 2030, one honourable member opposite said he'd lost the plot. Another one said anyone with half a brain would realise how dire things are. Yeah. And a former Conservative leader said that the country would be better off under new leadership. Yeah. And now the Prime Minister is at war with his own Defence Secretary after confirming he will break his manifesto pledge in increasing defence spending. Under this government, Britain is set to have less troops, less planes and less ships. The only thing the Prime Minister's interested in is defending his own job. Just how many more troops have to lose their jobs before he finally says enough is enough?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In fact, there's a £24 billion increase for armed forces. Spending on the armed forces is rising to 2.3% of GDP, again making us the largest military spender in Europe. And frankly, we'll take no lessons from the Right Honourable Lady when it comes to security in this country. First thing she did when she became an MP, 2016, voted against Trident, leaving us exposed. And she was campaigning for the Right Honourable Member for Islington North to be Prime Minister, someone who would take us out of NATO.
Mr Speaker, talking about NATO, where was the honourable member when the situation in Afghanistan on a sun lounger? That's where the honourable member was. I take no lectures from the honourable member when it comes to doing your job. The Prime Minister said He felt no shame over the by-election defeats. He said his government have been quite exceptional. Well, I agree that they've been exceptional, all right. An exceptional record on stagnant wages, rising poverty and broken promises. And the Prime Minister wants to drag this out until 2030s. And how much more can he stomach before he finds the guts, Mr. Speaker? How many more tax rises? How many more families drove into poverty? And how many manifesto pledges broken? I hope for the sake of the British public, Mr. Speaker, that we never find out. And when will the Deputy Prime Minister finally grow a backbone and tell the Prime Minister the game is up?
Mr. Speaker, I can't help thinking that Right Honourable Lady is auditioning for the leadership contest on that side, not really referring to anything on this side. She's got the support of the honourable member. Look, I'll tell you what we're doing. We're putting in place the policies to grow our economy, to help...
Mr Murray, we've had a good questions already for Scotland. It's not continued. It's not your debate. Come on.
Mr. Speaker, he was just announcing his support for the Right Honourable Lady in the forthcoming... We're putting in place the economic plan to help people with the cost of living. The Labour leader is getting ready for year zero. We're the ones supporting Ukraine with sanctions on Russia, with military support. The Honourable Lady voted to abolish Trident. We're the ones making the streets safer, more police and tougher sentencing under the Police Crime Sentencing Act in force this week. She voted against both. They got no plan. They're not fit to govern, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Eden Project North has been 5 years of my parliamentary life. We've gone through 3 Prime Ministers, 4 Chancellors, a plethora of ministers, but no, what we've got to the point is that the levelling up bid is going to go in very shortly. We've got a shovel-ready plan. We've got full planning permission. Does my right honourable friend agree with me? It is money worth spending in Morecambe.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, there is no greater and more tenacious campaigner than the honourable member for his constituents. He'll know, I can't discuss the details of any specific bids, but the next round of funding allocations will be announced in the autumn, so we won't have to wait too much longer.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Deputy Prime Minister and the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party at the sad death of Dame Deborah James. Our thoughts and prayers are with her family at this trying time, and we thank her for all that she has done to raise money for anti-cancer. Mr. Speaker, Scotland's First Minister has set the date and started the campaign. Our nation will have its independence referendum on the 19th of October 2023. The reality is Scotland has already paid the price for not being independent. Westminster governments we did not vote for, imposing policies we don't support. Breaking international law, dragging Scotland through a damaging Brexit we didn't vote for, and delivering deep austerity cuts. Contrast that with our European neighbours, who have greater income equality, lower poverty rates and higher productivity. Mr. Speaker, why not Scotland? In the weeks and months ahead, we will make the positive case for independence. Will the opposition, if they can, make the case for continued Westminster rule?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? It's always good to see him in his place. No, genuinely, it's good to see him in his place. It's not the right time for another referendum, given the challenges that we face as one United Kingdom. And I think, and he referred to some of the challenges in Scotland, but I think actually the people of Scotland want their 2 governments to work together, and we are keen, willing, enthusiastic to do so.
Ian Blackfoot.
There is no case for the union, as we've just heard from the Deputy Prime Minister, because, Mr. Speaker, the harsh reality is that the Tories might fear democratic debate, but they don't have the right to block Scottish democracy. As the late Canon Kenyon Wright said, what if the other voice we all know so well responds by saying, "We say no, we are the state"? His answer, well, we say yes, and we are the people. Just last year, the member for Murray the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, no less, put it in his own words. A vote for the Scottish National Party is another vote for an independence referendum. Well, you won't often hear me say this, but I agree with them, and so do the Scottish people. Scottish democracy will not be a prisoner of any Prime Minister in this place. So why is the UK government scared of democracy? Or is it simply that they have run out of ideas to defend the failing Westminster system?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank the honourable gentleman. I think he's rather airbrushing history with that long soliloquy. But look, he mentioned the problems that Scotland faces. Huge tax burden imposed by the SNP. Scotland's record on science and maths under the international PISA rankings are now have dropped below England and Wales, and the SNP have presided over the worst drug death rate in Europe, the highest since records began. I think the people of Scotland expect their government in Holyrood and in Westminster to work together to tackle the issues facing them in their day-to-day lives. That's what we're doing.
Peter Alders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There are great opportunities. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my sincere apologies. There are, Mr. Speaker, great opportunities to create exciting new jobs in low-carbon energy along the East Anglian coast, and East Coast College are up for the challenge of providing local people with the necessary skills. However, they and other colleges are finding it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain teachers in such work as fabrication, engineering and construction. Will my right honourable friend ensure that the government come up with a cross-departmental strategy to address this staffing crisis in our further education colleges, which could undermine the levelling up agenda?
Obviously, Deputies Day. Come on,
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and that's why we're investing nearly £52 million to support the sector in recruiting and retaining excellent staff, and in particular looking and focusing on the experience and the skills that we can often find in industry to train the next generation of technical experts.
Dale Hamby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No country that values its independence and indeed its self-respect could agree to a treaty which signed away its economic independence and self-government. Ultimately, membership of any union that involves pooling of sovereignty can only be sustained with the consent of the people. Yes. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with the Prime Minister and his predecessor, yes or no?
Yeah. Deputy Prime Minister.
I just say to the honourable gentleman, that's why we had the referendum a few years ago. The people of Scotland spoken, and we think it's not the right time to be relitigating this issue.
John Burren.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking with Lord Ahmed yesterday, I thank the government for now listening and allowing high-risk British Council contractors still in Afghanistan to be processed immediately upon their application to the Citizen Resettlement Scheme and not having to wait a further 2 months until the application window closes. With taxation at a 40-year high, when will the government be bolder in cutting taxes, given all the evidence the world over shows that lower taxes increases prosperity, raises living standards, and better enables the government to help the less fortunate, even if such a policy means cutting spending such as HS2?
My honourable friend makes an important point about driving growth in the economy, and that's why we're cutting taxes with the 130% super deduction for capital investment. That will not just create good jobs, but well-paid jobs and better-paid jobs by boosting productivity. That's why we're increasing the employment allowance, which represents a tax cut of £1,000 for 500,000 small businesses. That's why we've provided business rate relief of £7 billion over the next 5 years. And of course, we're cutting national insurance just next month, worth £330 for a typical employee.
Patricia Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Tory MSP Murdo Fraser points out, Scotland has a third of Britain's landmass, half its territorial waters, over 60% of UK fishing zones, 98% of oil reserves, 63% of natural gas, a quarter of Europe's offshore wind resources and 90% of the UK's fresh water. Can the Deputy Prime Minister explain if his opposition to Scottish independence is because he fears the loss of these invaluable resources.
Deputy Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right in what she just said. There are huge assets right across Scotland, and that's why we think we're stronger together in delivering for the people of Scotland.
Oliver Hill.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister will be aware that in North East Hertfordshire we have some of the best farmland in the country. And at a time when there are concerns about food production, food security, at a time when the government is considering rural land use, isn't it time to ensure that our productive farmland isn't covered in solar plants and that they are positioned rather on brownfield sites, on buildings and on low-grade agricultural land?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I think he makes a powerful point, and our 2023 land use framework will set out our priorities for land use across the country, and he's right that we've got to protect the most versatile agricultural land, and any plans for ground-mounted solar installations will have to take that very point into account. His point is well made.
Rosie Duffy.
So far this year, 52 women have been killed in the UK. Our rights to free speech, safe spaces, fairness in sport, and even the words we use to describe our own bodies are all under threat. Will the Deputy Prime Minister send a clear signal, as some of his Cabinet colleagues have done this week, that Britain respects the rights of women? And will he accept the cross-party amendment to his forthcoming Bill of Rights, which enshrines a woman's right to choose in law?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question? Can I also just say at the outset what huge respect I personally have for her with the way she stood up for women's rights and frankly the appalling harassment, trolling and bullying that she's faced. The position, as she knows, is settled in UK law in relation to abortion. It's decided by honourable members across this House. It's an issue of conscience. I don't think there is a strong case for change. What I wouldn't want to do is find ourselves with the greatest respect in the US position where this is being litigated through the courts rather than settled, as it is now settled, by honourable members in this House.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In February 2019, this House passed my excellent Civil Partnerships, Marriages and Deaths Registration, etc. Act, mandating government to extend civil partnerships to opposite-sex couples, enabling marriage records to include mothers' details, and requiring the Justice Secretary to produce a report empowering coroners to investigate stillbirths. The first two have come into force very successfully, but 2.5 years on, despite further shocking revelations about deaths of babies at several hospitals, no report has yet been published, nor regulations to give coroners the powers they need. Why not?
Can I thank my honourable friend? He's absolutely right to raise this, and of course stillbirth is an appalling tragedy which has the most devastating impact on families across the country. He's right, the MOJ, the DHSC have jointly consulted on proposals to provide coroners with new powers in this regard. I have looked at this personally. We will be publishing the government's response to the consultation very shortly.
Ellen Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Threatened, terrified, alone. This was how survivors of sexual violence told me they felt when they were pressured into signing non-disclosure agreements and gagging clauses by their universities. No victim of sexual assault or harassment should ever be coerced into silence by the very institutions who are meant to protect them. Not at university, not at work, not anywhere. So will the government back my bill to ban the use of NDAs in cases of sexual harassment, bullying and misconduct? And will the Deputy Prime Minister consider meeting with me in his role as Justice Secretary to discuss how we'll put a stop to this deplorable practice once and for all?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady, I'll look very carefully at any particular proposals she has. We've got to do everything we can to protect women and girls in this country, and also, frankly, to make them feel more confident in the justice system. That's why I'm relieved, but restless to go further, but relieved that The volume of rape convictions in the last year alone is up by 2/3. And of course, in the Police Courts Sentencing and Crime Act in force this week, we have taken extra measures, for example, by extending the time limit for reporting domestic abuse and also criminalising taking photos of a mother breastfeeding without consent. And I'll certainly look at the proposals that she's raised with me.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are investing nearly £190 billion this year into the NHS, and yet many of us see disturbing deficiencies within NHS management, no more so than in the Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust. 4 years ago, in 2018, my right honourable friend, the member for Ludlow, and I secured £312 million for a major A&E modernisation within our local hospital trust. 4 years on, construction has still not started. What message can the Deputy Prime Minister give to the people of Shrewsbury as to how government can intervene to break this gridlock and finally allow the £312 million we have secured to be utilised for the benefits of the people of Shropshire and Mid Wales?
Well, my honourable friend is a doughty champion of his constituents, particularly on NHS services. The DHSC recently received the strategic outline case for the transformation of A&E services in Shrewsbury and Telford. It's still being processed, but I can tell him that the Trust is aiming to present the full business case in 2023, with construction starting in the same year.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd hyd yn oed. When he announced his Bill of Rights last week, the Deputy Prime Minister said it will strengthen our UK tradition of freedom. Freedom, shameless, from a government whose contempt for the rule of law and devolution can be judged in equal measure. They're scrapping Welsh law against our will, denying Scotland the right to choose their own future. That isn't freedom. Will he prove me wrong? Will he prove me wrong by enshrining self-determination in his Bill of Rights?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I thought it was very deft the way she got that in. I think we've all heard, actually, across the benches today, the case for reinforcing free speech, whether it's the judge-made privacy laws or some of the way people are shouted down when they express legitimate opinions. And I also think that the people of Wales will want to join with us, as true across the country, making sure we can deport more foreign national offenders. That is the reality for the people in Wales and across the United Kingdom, and I think the Bill of Rights will be strengthening our tradition of freedom, but also curbing those abuses and making sure we inject a bit more common sense into the system.
Johnny Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Derriford Hospital in my constituency is part of the new hospital build programme announced by this government, and work on the new emergency department actually starts this year, which is a significant investment for the amazing staff there and the brilliant Chief Executive, Anne James, who works so hard. But given the incredible pressures on the real estate in Derriford, would my honourable friend consider prioritising capital investment into that part of the UK to ensure that we can accelerate these plans, particularly in digital, so that people in Plymouth get the world-class healthcare they deserve?
Can I thank my honourable friend? Look, he's absolutely right. This is the largest hospital building programme in a generation, and his constituents are going to benefit very directly. I can tell him that there will be a new integrated emergency care hospital scheme for University Hospitals Plymouth NHS Trust at the Derriford Emergency Care Hospital. And yes, on tech, he's absolutely right. The facilities will be at the cutting edge of modern technology, and that will really help drive up the quality of patient care.
Bill Fairness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The victims of black cab rapist John Warboys were only able to challenge the police's failure to investigate his appalling crimes because of the Human Rights Act. They would not have been able to do so under the Deputy Prime Minister's new so-called Bill of Rights. Why does he want to stop women like the victims of John Warboys from making sure that police protect them from rape and sexual assault and getting the justice they deserve?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for the opportunity? It was not the result of litigation that addressed the problems with the Warboy case. And indeed, if she wants to look after victims in cases like that and others, the Labour Party should join with us, not just in supporting the Bill of Rights, but our parole reforms that will make sure dangerous offenders are not released and we protect the public.
David Simmons.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr Speaker, my constituent Joel Lindop has suffered the abduction of his young children to Poland, one of many families in the UK who go through a similar experience every year. And despite repeated judgments in his favour in the courts in Poland, he's been unable to persuade the Polish authorities to fulfil their obligations under international law and return those children to their family. Will my right honourable friend intercede and ensure that my constituent and the many other families who face this challenge are able to ensure that their children are returned safely and in a timely fashion in the future?
Can I thank my honourable friend? Look, I can't imagine how appalling that situation must be for any parent to find themselves in. He'll know we're committed to the 1980 Hague Convention on Child Abduction, and that does provide a mechanism. He's right that that's one that has to be driven through the courts, and that's not something we can directly interfere on, but I will make sure, and I'll speak to the Foreign Office and see if the Minister can address whether there's anything further that we can properly do to support him.
Brendan Michael.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. A serious question on the conduct of the government as regards free trade agreements. And I cannot understate the fury of the International Trade Committee this morning that led us to unanimously empty chair the Secretary of State for International Trade. The government has broken its word to the committee, to the House and to you, Mr Speaker, on scrutiny of the Australian trade deal by triggering CRAG and now endangering a committee report. It is the unanimous view of the committee, Mr Speaker, Tory, Labour, SNP and DUP, that CRAG should be delayed to allow proper scrutiny, as was promised. Will the government deliver on its promise and therefore delay CRAG?
I understand,
Prime Minister.
I understand, Mr Speaker, that the Secretary of State for International Trade has agreed to come back and address the committee just as soon as possible.
Tim Sunderland.
Mr Speaker, I was privileged last week to attend the Malaria Summit in Kigali. Even today, malaria remains the biggest single killer of mankind ever, and 1.7 billion people are living every day under its shadow of misery. But, Mr Speaker, we're on the cusp of something really special, in that recent advances, education and our British world-leading vaccines can now eradicate it forever. Can my right honourable friends please confirm that the UK will fulfil its full commitment to the Global Fund?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend? I know from working at the Foreign Office just how powerful the Global Fund is. It's a very high-performing international organisation. He will know that since 2002 we've been the third largest donor, so we've stepped up to the plate. The UK hasn't yet determined our pledge for the 7th replenishment, but I know the Foreign Secretary will have heard loud and clear the advocacy that he's made in their regard.
Final question, Bel Ribeiro Addy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In their efforts to pursue a hostile environment, the Home Office routinely tears families apart and breaks human rights and equalities legislation. They're reported to be sending up yet another charter deportation flight to Nigeria and Ghana. In Pride Month, they'll be deporting LGBT asylum seekers, fleeing homophobia, and grandmothers and mothers of British children who have lived in this country for over 25 years. Given that the Home Office repeatedly get it wrong and end up having to take people off these flights, can the Deputy Prime Minister tell me how many people have been removed from this flight already, and when will they stop these inhumane deportation charter flights?
Deputy Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable lady. Look, she's right at least in one respect. Of course, people who come here need to be treated decently and humanely. We're absolutely committed to that. We also need to make sure that we cut down the illegal routes, and those that are here who've committed serious offences can be returned home. And the crucial thing, and I'm working with the Home Secretary, is to make sure we do both of those things. But what we can't allow is illegal routes to flourish into this country, otherwise we'll just attract more. And we cannot allow people who commit serious offences in this country to stay and continue to pose a threat to the public.
Ends questions.
Of the deputies, the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab answering questions from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner. Well, it was very lively. They've certainly clashed before, so they are getting to know each other in terms of style across the dispatch box. Let me introduce our guests for this part of the programme. For the Government, the Home Office Minister Victoria Atkins, and John Healey for Labour, the Shadow Defence Secretary, and my colleague, political correspondent Ben Wright. Welcome to all of you. First of all, Ben, let me start with you with your assessment of what actually actually happened between Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab. It was knockabout to some extent, but there are also the important questions of cost of living, whose side are you on, referring to the rail strikes by Dominic Raab, and then there was this sort of pointed idea of who is out of touch, or rather who is in touch with how the public are feeling at this moment. What did you make of it?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. It was very pugnacious political theatre from the stand-ins. I think you could see that Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab really enjoy sparring with each other, more, I think, than Boris Johnson and Sir Keir Starmer necessarily do.
Maybe because it's shadow boxing in that sense, to
yeah,
some
but
extent.
they just really enjoyed grappling there on the floor of the House of Commons. But it clattered over a lot of territory. I mean, there wasn't a single focus. They talked about the cost of living, they talked about strikes, they talked about taxation, they talked about defence spending. All of these things are in the air at the moment. But both of them also were defending their absent leaders. Angela Rayner started off by saying that Boris Johnson intends to limp on until the 2030s, asking the Cabinet to stand up and try and get rid of him. And then at the end, Dominic Raab accused Angela Rayner of effectively auditioning for the job of Labour leader herself. So they enjoyed it. I'm not sure we learnt very much at the end of it, but I think the defence spending line of questioning clearly was very pertinent to today with Boris Johnson at the NATO summit, and an argument about how much and how big the future commitment that the government are going to have about defence spending will be.
All right, well, let's start off with defence spending. As Ben says, it is very pertinent, particularly with the war in Ukraine and that G7 summit. Victoria, how much more are you going to spend on defence in the light of that war, going above and beyond, as the Defence Secretary has called for, our existing commitment to NATO?
Well, over the last few years, we have absolutely met the commitment of 2%. Spending 2% of GDP being spent on defence.
But that was before, of course, the war in Ukraine, and Defence Secretary say we need more.
And this year we will be spending 2.3%, including the vital provision of machinery and equipment that we've been sending to Ukraine. But look, I have the great honour of representing RAF Coningsby in my constituency. That's one of the 2 quick reaction alert teams. So if anyone comes near our airspace, my constituents are up in a typhoon seeing them off. And so I'm very, very pleased to hear both the Prime Minister but also the Defence Secretary's commitment to ensuring that we have the assets and the people we need.
Right, but what does that mean? You are right, the UK is meeting its existing commitment, but Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, has asked the Prime Minister for an increase to 2.5% by 2028. Is he right? Would you agree to that?
Well, Ben will, of course, continue discussions in Cabinet. The Prime Minister has set out today that we are already exceeding our NATO target. I think this is really important. We've got to realise that the future is very different from perhaps even a few years ago when we set those ambitions.
John Healey, how much should we be spending now over and beyond our existing commitment to NATO?
Well, first, I do think it's disappointing and it's letting the country down that on this first day of NATO, we've got UK ministers rowing in public about levels of defence spending, and 14 other countries have already, since the invasion of Ukraine, moved to review their defence spending, reboot their defence plans, reform their defence procurement. We've had no action on any front at all.
But isn't that what the UK
government.
government is doing as well? They
No,
are
it's not.
debating it. They've called for a grown-up discussion. You call it rowing. They may be just reviewing it in the same way.
Well, they're clearly divided. They clearly haven't made any decisions. I'm talking about 14 other European countries that have made decisions, reviewed their spending, rebooted their defence plans and are reforming their defence procurement. We're doing none of that.
Right, how much would you like it to be set at? Do you agree with Ben Wallace, 2.5% by 2028?
Well, Labour will always do what's needed.
What does that mean, then? Because you've criticised the government and yet you won't say yourself, and that's reportedly what Ben Wallace is calling for, is 2.5%.
Let me answer in this way. Labour will always do what's needed to defend the country and protect the British public and fulfil in full our NATO obligations. During each year of the 13 years of the last Labour government, the average GB NATO, commitment to NATO was 2.4% of GDP. Now, you cannot, from opposition, fix detailed figures without access to, and Victoria knows this, highly confidential information about adversaries, weapons technologies, costs and threats. That's what we would do immediately after an election, but we can't do it now in opposition.
Victoria? If I may just correct John, we are leading the way in Europe in terms of our provision of help to Ukraine. As I say, we have absolutely met our NATO commitments, and indeed we're exceeding them. I think rather than, what would be good actually is if we can have a sensible discussion about what the future looks like the next 5-10 years, including, for example, reaffirming our commitment not just to NATO, as Jeremy Corbyn wanted us to leave, but also to the nuclear deterrent, which again, frontbenchers, including Angela Rayner, voted against. These are important, vitally important measures of our national defence, and we as Conservatives have the history of not just supporting them, but going further.
I'll come to that in a minute. What do you say in response to that about Labour's reputation when it comes to being strong on security and defence?
First of all, in the crisis, the UK's government support, military support for Ukraine has been first rate. It's had our full Labour support, and that will continue. Our argument is with a government that hasn't got a plan to deal with the long-term problems. 14 other countries have sorted this. We still are yet to review our defence spending and settle that, reboot our defence plans, get to grips with a massive level of waste in military procurement, and halt and rethink the army cuts. Now, those are things that this government needs to do. And I have to tell you, the arguments like this that we've been making for months are now increasingly made by experts and ex-military figures that can see the threats changing. And to bring it back to the start, any government, any democracy, when there's newly defined threats facing our national security or a European security, have to respond. We did this after the 9/11 attacks as a Labour government, when we introduced immediately after that the longest sustained real increase in defence spending for 2 decades.
But if you look at the front bench,
but also we'll come to that later. But in terms of the government's commitment, you have just broken a firm manifesto commitment announced by Number 10 yesterday to increase the defence budget by at least 0.5% above inflation every year of the new Parliament. Can you really justify that when we've got this ongoing war in Ukraine and future security issues that we need to deal with in the way John Healey has outlined?
So just as John has been calling for a sensible discussion, we also have to bear in mind what has happened since that commitment was made. It's not by way of excuse, it's just a fact that we've had to spend £400 billion on supporting, rightly supporting our economy during COVID. That was not foreseen by anyone. But the government's commitment to defence and to ensuring that we have armed services that are absolutely fit and dynamic for the future, it goes to our very core. And this is the difference between Labour and Conservative. You know, I support and always will do our nuclear deterrence, our armed forces, and our commitment to NATO. I'm afraid there are members of John's colleagues on the front bench who have voted against certainly nuclear deterrence and supported Mr Corbyn's call to leave NATO.
Well, he's no longer
settled position in every election under every Labour leader since Neil Kinnock, right the way through and including Jeremy Corbyn, has been full commitment to the UK independent nuclear deterrent and an unshakable commitment to NATO. That continues. The difference between us is quite easy to show. Look, in the last year of the last Labour government, the spending on defence was 2.6%, and then we had a decade of defence cuts. You've cut 40,000 full-time troops from our forces over that time. You've taken 1 in 5 of our Navy surface ships out of commission. You've scrapped, in the last 5 years alone, more than 200 RAF planes. And you've seen satisfaction in service life fall below 50% for the first time ever. Look, you've weakened the foundations of our armed forces. The recent cash injection was catch-up funding. But we're in the face of new threats, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have to do more, and we expect more of our government.
Ben, listening to our two politicians there, trading both on commitment financially and personally to the defence agenda, who wins this argument?
Well, the argument about the cash is very live because inflation obviously is soaring. And the Royal United Services Institute has said, and the House of Commons Library says the same, that in pure hard cash terms, the amount of money that is being spent on defence, I think, will fall actually in 2023 and 2024. I think that's right. So, it's not going up at quite the sort of vertiginous speed that I think the government likes to say. And you compare it to where the UK was back in the 50s and 60s. We spend far, far less on defence now than we used to, and there's a massive choice, I think, for this government and future governments about whether that is going to increase significantly in the years ahead because of the new threats we're all talking about.
Well, following on from what you've just said, this is a good place to show our viewers and our guests this graph from the Institute for Fiscal Studies on precisely the issue of how much UK governments have been spending on health and defence. Because if you look here at the two lines, blue for health, red for defence, you can see the crossover there, the peace dividend, we would call it, at the end of the Cold War. John, talking in the way you have passionately about the need to restore and improve the cash commitment to defence, would you have to cut health, which is also extremely important? There would have to be a trade-off, wouldn't there, between those two extremely important issues and priorities?
Your graph's very telling, and the point at which it starts to dip is the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the end of the Cold War. It isn't just about how much you spend, it's also about how well you spend.
Sure.
No, it's really important, particularly with a military procurement system that the Public Accounts Committee have branded as broken. We've seen £5 billion of waste in the last 3 years alone with MOD misjudgment and mismanagement. So it's how well you spend and how well you manage that, as well as how much you spend, that counts. And that would be a big part of our plans.
And it's always been difficult, hasn't it, for successive governments, Labour and Conservatives. But given the choice and the economic conditions that we find ourselves in, do you agree that there would have to be a reduction in something as large that uses up an awful lot of our spending and GDP, would have to come down in health in order to push up what you want to spend on defence?
It's part of the tough decisions that any government, including our Labour government, would make directly after the election, which is why I answered your earlier question to say you absolutely can't fix firm figures from opposition, particularly when you haven't seen the books. And in defence, you haven't seen the threat assessments, you haven't seen what the adversaries are up to, you don't know what the weapons systems they're developing are, and you don't know the full information about the costs and indeed the waste.
I mean, I think what's interesting about Labour's position on this is that following the Jeremy Corbyn years, you can hear John Healey and his colleagues straining to say that, look, we were the party with Ernest Bevin back in the 1940s who were there at the foundation of NATO. We've got a history of being tough on national security. I think they feel they've got to sort of rebuild that reputation, which was knocked pretty hard in the Jeremy Corbyn years. And the question is whether the Labour Party membership now and the base and MPs in Parliament will stomach that sort of reprioritisation of money that John Healey's talking about. I mean, many in the Labour Party think that you should continue to focus completely on public services and health and education and not go for the sort of defence spending that you're potentially envisaging.
I've served in government, so has Keir Starmer. We know the first duty of any government is to defend the country and keep the citizens safe, and that's what Labour will do.
Is it the end of the peace dividend in your eyes, Victoria? When you look at that graph, do we need to reprioritise when we have a war in Europe in terms of the amount we spend on health?
We have to be very clear-eyed about the fact that this war will go on for a long time, potentially, as the Prime Minister has said.
So reprioritise spending?
We have to look again at, I think, what we are doing to ensure that the integrated review, which, for example, we brought in, John perhaps forgot about that, that is brought into action. We have to ensure also that we are fighting the threats that...
Sure, but does that mean spending less on health and putting it into defence? Because these are the real choices you have to make.
Very much so. We make them day in, day out. I mean, we have just recently had to bring in the national insurance increase in order to inject a further £39 billion into the NHS in the wake of the pandemic. So these are very tough decisions. But, Ben, as a former soldier serving officer himself, he is very, very capable of making those assessments.
Ben Wallace, just in case they get confused with Ben Wright. Ben Wright sitting here just to clarify.
But I wonder if we're going to see other ministers too following Ben Wallace's example and making such public pitches for money for their departments. I mean, we're a long way off the next spending review, but already Ben Wallace has decided to be very front-footed about this. And I wonder if other departments are going to be being equally public and vociferous about the cash they need to see.
There's always good debate and discussion amongst colleagues about departmental spending and allocations. But I mean, I'm actually in the MOJ, and one of the things we're one of the things we are absolutely determined to deliver on is our commitment to build, for example, new prisons, to provide new prison places, to support the rest of the criminal justice system that is going absolutely great guns to try and ensure that we're catching criminals and securing justice for victims. So there will always be this debate, as there would be, in fairness, in any government, between departments.
And just to clarify, yes, Ministry of Justice.
Ministry of Justice.
My mistake, saying you were in the Home Office. Can I go back to the point that we made that the government has announced that it is breaking a manifesto commitment that it made? You said it's for the reasons of the sort of realpolitik of surging inflation. There is a question about whether voters can really trust anything that politicians say when they make commitments. What do you say to that?
I very much hope they do feel they can. I think also members of the public, you know, they know what's happening both with the pandemic and the backlogs and the hangover, if you like, from the pandemic. They also know what is happening worldwide in relation to inflation. And so I think there's a lot of understanding when we have mature discussions about how situations have changed and what we need to do to reflect that. And in fairness, the PM throughout his tenure has been very, very open to making, you know, big decisions and changing and prioritising according to what is happening at the time.
And it's the same for the Labour leader Keir Starmer. He once described the 2017 manifesto as our foundational document during his leadership bid in 2020 and praised its radicalism. He's now said we're going to start from scratch. We're going to put those past manifestos to one side. So which is it? Do we trust what politicians say?
Well, I've served in the Labour Shadow Cabinet right after 4 election defeats, and it's always the same. When you're rejected by the public, you rethink. If you don't, you continue to lose. And I think what this shows...
Although we said it was a foundational document post those losses in both 17 and 19, and I take your point, 19 was much more disastrous than 2017.
Well, 2017 is now 5 years ago. We've been through the COVID. The world's changed. I think what this shows is that you've got a Labour Party that's changed under Keir Starmer, and it shows that Labour is thinking afresh about the action needed to deal with the problems that people face and get the country back on the right track again. And we saw this, I have to say, in the Wakefield by-election, where people had given up on the government, I'm sad to say, and they were looking to Labour for some of the answers on a windfall tax to help them with energy costs, big investment in new green jobs and new tech, a catch-up plan for their kids because they suffered in COVID. These are the answers that all politicians, but particularly an opposition that wants to convince people that we can be an alternative government, that we've got a plan for the future. This is the task that faces us.
Well, then let's talk about the strikes briefly, since you bring it up, because they're the similar words to David Lammy, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, used about sort of whose side are you on in the rail strikes. And there were Labour MPs, some Shadow front benchers on the picket line. I understand they are just going to get a ticking off for that. One might ask, what about the BA strikes that have now been balloted for? Why aren't you supporting those? I mean, they've got a legitimate claim, haven't they? British Airways ground staff, their pay was cut 10% during the pandemic, and all they want is it to be restated. Do you think you shouldn't be supporting them?
I want to see this settled. I can see this group of workers that were hit by the airlines and the airport with a very brutal fire and rehire and a 10% cut during the pandemic. They were promised that would be restored.
So you'd support your colleagues going on the picket line to support them?
Well, nobody wants to see any strike action. The chaos at our airports is bad enough already, and that's down to the airport companies. So what we need is the unions with the employers coming to negotiated settlements on that. And on the rail strike, where the government is a party to this, you know, the rail workers were really left with no choice. And the government... let me put it this way. If we had, instead of in the Shadow Cabinet, if we had a Labour Cabinet, we had Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, we'd have government acting in a very different way. It would be getting the parties together, trying to get a resolution to the dispute so that the rail workers got a fair pay
and I'll put that to Victoria.
plan for
But
the
in terms
railways.
of the position from Keir Starmer, he said Labour MPs and certainly the front bench shouldn't be on the picket line, and some of them were. So should they be sanctioned in some way?
Look, we'll deal with that in time, but in the Labour shadow cabinet, our job is in Parliament. It's not on a picket line, and our full focus should be on getting the government to do its job, help resolve the dispute instead of fanning the divisions and trying to take political advantage about something that is damaging the interests of our commuters, damaging the interests of our economy as well.
All right. Well, let me pick up on something that was raised as a question in today's Prime Minister's questions from the Tory MP John Barron, who said, we have the highest tax burden in 40 years, despite the Conservatives and the government repeatedly saying we are a party of low taxation. Victoria, you surely can't claim to be a party of low taxation with that record. But he did say, when will this government be bold enough, when will the Prime Minister be bold enough to cut taxes? When will it be?
Well, just picking on the previous point that...
Briefly.
Oh, yes,
I think
let's
the
talk about
difference...
strikes.
well, let's actually, John, the difference between, I suspect, the rail strike and the BA or other industry action is that I'm told that since 2011 the Labour Party's received £100 million
Well, do you have sympathy for the BA
So I have great sympathy for John, because I think he's in a very difficult
All right, well,
position,
let's answer, because we haven't got that long. We haven't got that long left. What about the party of supposedly low taxation, which you clearly aren't at the moment, the highest tax burden in 40 years? When are you going to cut taxes in the way you say?
Well, Rishi, the Chancellor, set out his plans to cut income tax in the most recent budget. We've got to, again, look at this very responsibly. We've got to make sure that it is costed. We have already been able, as of next month, to raise the threshold of national insurance.
Yeah, that's after increasing taxation to its highest level.
Importantly, it will mean that 70% of workers will, in fact, be better off after this. So we really, really want to get to that place. We have also got to be realistic, though, about what has happened over the last couple of years with the pandemic.
Has the government, the Conservative Party, lost its credibility on this issue, Ben? It's interesting that the fire on this is coming from the Tory backbenches.
Yeah, and the undisputable fact about the current tax burden being as high as it is very difficult for a lot of Tory MPs, and there is a cacophonous call from Tory backbenchers for the government to do something on tax. And as you said, Rishi Sunak has sort of penciled in a pre-election tax cut. People like David Davis were on the radio the other day demanding something much sooner than that. The question is, will the Chancellor, whoever it is at the time, feel that the public finances and the situation, if we are heading into a recession, as others predict that we might be, will they allow for that sort of income tax cut when the time comes?
We'll leave that question hanging there. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me here in the studio. And a reminder that Politics Live is on air early tomorrow because of Wimbledon. That's at 10:15. Set your alarm clocks. From all of us here, bye.